Welcome to another episode of Challenging Conversations, where we aim to explore important and thought-provoking topics in the Christian faith. I'm your host, Jason Jimenez, and today we'll be examining the surprising decline of atheism globally and the significant rise in belief in God. For the past several decades, atheism has been gaining significant momentum, especially in the Western world. Influential figures of the new atheism movement, such as Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and the late Christopher Hitchens, have influenced public opinion, pointing towards a future dominated by naturalism and secularism. However, current developments are indicating that there's a surprise that is coming about. People from various continents and backgrounds are experiencing a resurgence in faith and spirituality, with many embracing in God once more. To help us navigate this fascinating shift from unbelief to belief in God, we have a very special guest with us today, Justin Brierley. Justin is the author of the best-selling book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God: Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. He also hosts the Surprising Rebirth podcast. So let's dive into this challenging conversation with Justin Brierley as he explains why the new atheism movement is losing momentum and why so many secular thinkers are drawn to Christianity. Justin, it's great to have you on the show.
It's great to be here, Jason. Thanks for having me on.
Now, obviously, many people probably know your name and have seen you before, so they know as I'm recording this in East Coast of the United States, in Charlotte, North Carolina, you are actually in England. So there's a huge little time difference between the two of us. So it's just great to have you. I know it's been a hectic schedule that you've been enduring for quite some time with some of the new things you're doing. But before we dive into this new book that you came out with recently, I'm sure a lot of people are wondering because, I mean, for many years, you were with the premier radio program known as Unbelievable. And I know I got a pun for you. I know it's unbelievable that you left that successful ministry. But why the shift and the change? And then obviously, what are you doing currently?
Yeah, so I did host the Unbelievable show, which brought Christians and non-Christians together for dialogue and debate for, believe it or not, for over 17 years. So right from when it was just a radio show through being a podcast to a video show eventually. And, we added on, international conferences and the books and all sorts of things. It was just the right time in the end at the sort of 17 and a half year mark where I moved on to move on for all kinds of reasons. I felt God was calling me to establish some new work, and that was just going to be, it was easiest to do that by saying goodbye, a bittersweet goodbye to Unbelievable, and moving into some new areas. So so the show continues, and there's still great episodes coming out, and obviously all the back catalogue of the years that I was hosting the show. And I owe a huge debt to that show and all the opportunities it gave me to meet so many amazing thinkers on both sides of the aisle, to develop a lot of friendships across the aisle as well, and to just think through faith for myself. When I started Unbelievable, I was kind of, I barely knew what apologetics was, and it was just a 17-year education really in
Right.
coming to terms with the arguments for and against, and in a ways all areas of theology that we covered. So I'm very grateful for it, but it does feel like my new season, if you like, of work is really building on all of those conversations that I had over those 17 plus years.
Yeah, I definitely, and obviously we're going to be talking about that in a minute. It seems like that's been the case, and just seeing how fruitful, like you said, those conversations. And I was telling you before we jumped on, I mean, even just, my work originally was in pastoral work with students and family for many years. And then in 2012, we made a huge shift, when I was at Southern Evangelical Seminary studying under Dr. Norman Geiser and people like Frank and others. And really this call to start more apologetics, like familiar with it, but not like heavily involved, like we are now. But as I dove into more challenging conversations and working at, in this realm of how divisive things are, and like there's a lot of aggressors out there, or a lot of Christians are avoiders. They don't know what to say. They're uncomfortable. And through the years, one person, and there's several obviously, but I was telling you earlier, which is amazing, was how you would get very, not just complex issues, but you would get a lot of polar opposite opinions and viewpoints with people, but be able to get them to agree on some things and have a civil conversation. I think that's so powerful. And so, yeah, that's why I'm excited now. Like, as you said, as you're kind of expanding on what you were involved with Premier, now with his new book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, I'd love to hear some reasons as to why you went even deeper from your original book, Unbelievable, when you said after 10 years of spending a lot of time with primarily atheists, how you still were not convinced that atheism is the way, but Christianity is. And then from that point, years later, you wrote this new book. What are some reasons why you felt that you wanted to explore this other avenue specifically on what you've been seeing with the decline of new atheism, but also this rise of belief in God?
Yeah, well, really, the first book was spelling out my case for faith at that point, at about the 10-year mark of hosting the Unbelievable show. And I felt ready at that point to kind of lay my cards on the table
Mm,
rather than being the neutral moderator. I felt I had gained enough experience and some knowledge and wisdom to be able to explain why I feel Christianity is the most compelling story of reality that exists. In many ways, the new book is building on that, but it's far more a look at what's going on in our culture. And so, in that sense, it's about the way the conversation on God has really moved on, even since I wrote that book. So, the Unbelievable show that I hosted for many years was born in the heyday of new atheism, so around 2005. This was when books like The God Delusion were being
mm-hmm,
written by Richard Dawkins. Best-selling anti-God books, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, were the so-called four horsemen of the
mm-hmm,
new atheism. And I remember well the London atheist bus campaign, where these red London buses were circulating the capital bearing the slogan, "There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life." And there were similar campaigns in the US. You had things like the Reason Rally in 2012, tens of thousands of people descending on the mall in Washington to campaign and sloganize for religion, or against religion, and for atheism and science and so on. So this was a kind of high watermark of new atheism, and in many ways, my first book was responding to that and lots of the questions that were being asked. The evidence for God. What about the problem of suffering? Science versus faith, and so on. But I have noticed the conversations change a lot in the years since that was, if you like, the kind of conversation that was dominating the culture at the time. I noticed increasingly over the years, more and more of the non-believers I invited onto my shows were often distinguishing themselves from this
mm,
quite dogmatic, aggressive form of atheism. They said, "I'm not a Richard Dawkins kind of atheist," and things like that. And I noticed also that the movement itself experienced all kinds of fractures and internal problems. So, for
mm,
instance, in around 2012, there was this famous incident that's been called Elevator Gate, in which basically a female atheist vlogger was propositioned in an elevator at an atheist conference in Dublin. And she had literally just given a whole seminar on the problem of sexism and misogyny in the atheist community. And that might have been the end of it, except that when she vlogged about it, Richard Dawkins weighed in with a heavily sarcastic blog post saying, just imagine, dear Muslima, he imagined a Muslim woman, you pity your poor American sisters being asked for coffee in an elevator. Anyway, this kind of response, this very sarcastic response, just poured gasoline on the whole thing. And people basically from that point on started taking sides. Some people wanted the atheist movement to go in this atheism plus direction, where
mm-hmm.
it was not only about science and reason, but it was about a commitment to maybe LGBT rights and feminism and justice issues and so on. And others on the Richard Dawkins side who said, no, this is all just political correctness gone mad. It was actually the beginnings, effectively, of what we now call the culture wars, and they kind of came early for new atheism. The
Mm,
movement split, and the falling out between the new atheist leaders was far worse than anything that had gone on between them and Christians. And I watched from the sidelines as atheist conferences were cancelled because some of these people refused to share a stage with each other. There was a huge amount of antagonism online. Even Richard Dawkins himself, the best known atheist in the world, had his Humanist of the Year award rescinded in 2021 by the Humanist Association of America because of his stance on transgender. That came to be another issue that divided the secular atheist community. So it was interesting to see the way in which new atheism itself kind of imploded in a funny way over those years, and frankly just didn't end up answering people's actual existential questions. And as the new atheism waned, I started to notice more and more people just giving Christianity a second look. Often these were secular people, and I started to hear about people turning up for 3-hour lectures on the Bible who had been turning up for Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins before. And who were they turning up to see? Well, Jordan Peterson, the well-known Canadian psychologist, who was suddenly drawing people not as a Christian, but as someone who was pointing them back to the value of faith, to the deep wisdom you can find in Scripture. And it was really from that point onwards, when Jordan Peterson came on the scene around 2017, 2018, that I started to notice a really different tone in the conversation. People started to talk about the value of faith. They didn't necessarily believe it, but they weren't dismissing it as evil in the way that the new atheists were. And so that was really the catalyst for me starting to think maybe something different is happening. And over the years, I started to chart that through the conversations I had. I realized people are talking about God differently. And it's what I now call the surprising rebirth of belief
Mm.
in God. And I genuinely think that movement has only increased in the years since then.
Yeah, see, you'd actually be a perfect person to ask this because of all the years of dealing with atheism specifically. I mean, I've had encounters with many of them, but not to the degree you have. Would you say also with this, and what in a minute I want to talk about this dissipation that you talk about in your book, kind of coinciding with what you were just alluding to about this culture wars that's splitting within atheism. So I'd like to explore that a little bit further. But before that, are you seeing this kindness though, this civility among atheists with Christians such as yourself and other people, where they're jumping in and wanting to have these warm conversations and like befriending one another and exploring more opportunity to dive into the spiritual realm?
Yeah, I think that the tone of the conversation has definitely changed. So obviously, the new atheism itself was often marked by, just dismissiveness, really, when it
Yeah.
came to religion. Very often ridicule. That was what Richard Dawkins encouraged people to do at the Reason Rally. Mock them, ridicule them. He said from the stage. And yeah, I have noticed a real change actually. People just being willing to listen and take Christianity more seriously. I think there was a sense in which people came to see the new atheist vibe as just too aggressive, too dogmatic, quite fundamentalist
Mm.
in itself. And I think a lot of people even started to realize that new atheism was kind of quasi-religious in itself. You could say that it had its four horsemen, who were the kind of four high priests of the movement. They had their sacred text, their anti-God books. There was a certain sort of creed, if you like, their materialist orthodoxy, and there were even heretics who were rounded upon if they kind of went aside from the naturalist creed that the new atheists preached. So there was a sense in which people who were still perhaps atheists, but still perhaps non-believers, they just wanted a better conversation than that, and they were willing to see that religion wasn't all bad. In fact, more and more people I was meeting who weren't necessarily Christians were still recognizing that actually it's not atheism or science or rationalism that we've got our morality from. For instance, more and more people recognizing that the things we hold as sacred, maybe human rights, equality, dignity, compassion, freedom, progress, these actually we've inherited from the Christian Revolution. So one particularly significant voice on this has been the historian Tom Holland, not the
Hmm.
Spider-Man actor, I should say,
Yeah,
but
exactly.
I started to invite Tom on for conversations as a non-Christian, but he was always having these very civil, fruitful dialogues with the Christians I brought him on with, because he recognized, even as a non-Christian, how important the Christian heritage had been. And he was very much a thorn in the side of those new atheists when he started to become quite a public figure and be recognized for this case that actually the morality and the moral instincts of the West really were given to us by the Christian Revolution.
And like many people, he was raised religious. Tom was, right? And I think even one point, one of his interviews talking about how his wife was religious, but he would profess to be an atheist still, correct?
Well, I think he would struggle to exactly say
Yeah.
what he is now. In my most recent public conversation with him, he talked about his some you know quite interesting spiritual moments in his life in the last couple of years, particularly one moment when he was making a documentary about ISIS, the Islamic State in northern Iraq. And this was several years ago, just at the time when ISIS had been riding roughshod through the area. And just the feelings he had when he witnessed a town, Sinjar, where men had actually been crucified by ISIS. And it brought home to him the reality of crucifixion, something he'd only sort of imagined, historically. And seeing it used for its original purpose really brought home the significance of Christian crucifixion, and just how strange it was that the first Christians glorified someone who died the death of a rebel slave on a cross. And he had this very powerful moment in a sort of bombed out church, where he said he felt like the veil between heaven and earth was very thin. And then a couple of years later, he had a sort of cancer diagnosis, and he had started to attend a historic church in London. And he says he prayed a kind of desperate prayer, one midnight mass, and within a couple of weeks, the situation had completely reversed. I think he still struggles to say exactly what, that he's a Christian per se, but I know he goes to church, and I know he tries his best in that sense to believe. He wants to have faith at some level. I mean, that's what's going on at a personal level for Tom Holland. At an intellectual level, he's been saying for years anyway that in almost every respect, as far as his morality goes, he does think of himself as a Christian, because it was really stepping into the shoes of the Greeks and the Romans when he started to kind of look at the history of that era and start to write his popular work on it. He realized just how alien their values and culture were to his own. This was a culture where slavery was just a de facto part of the economy, where the lives of women and children were cheap, where some people could be the sexual property of other people. And he realized that the difference was what made him value equality, dignity, human rights, and so on, was the fact that Jesus of Nazareth had come on the scene 2,000 years before and had begun this movement which completely reshaped the way we think about humans. And he began to see how he's simply an heir of that. And the water we swim in the West, even when people, say they don't believe in God, they're actually still living as though there is a God, as though the Christian story is true. So he's been on a really interesting intellectual and personal journey. I talk about him quite a lot in the book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, because he's been a really interesting dialogue partner, and feature him quite a bit in the podcast series as well. And again, he's one of these people who has a massive platform. Not only did he write this best-selling book, Dominion, making this case for the way in which Christianity shaped the morality of the West, but he co-hosts probably the most popular history podcast in the world, The Rest is History, and again frequently talks about the way his views on Christianity have changed over the years. So I find more and more people opening up, at least to the fact that we owe Christianity an awful lot because of the influence of Tom Holland. And another interesting person who's come on the scene recently in this respect is Ayaan Hirst Yali, who herself was part of the New Atheist cadre of speakers and thinkers, who herself says her own conversion to Christianity, she says, was due in part to reading and being convinced by Tom Holland's thesis. So he's having an enormous influence. And like many of these secular thinkers reconsidering Christianity, I think this is a very different kind of tone and time that we're in now when it comes to the God conversation.
Yeah, because it's almost like when you think of what you're saying about Tom Holland, he was probably engaging a lot of great Christian thinkers, not like just dead ones, that have gone before us, but even surrounding himself with Christian thinkers before you reached out to him and started to have more of this public dialogue on, your show at the time. I mean, which is rare when you said like the four horsemen. In some cases, a lot of them, like Richard Dawkins, like you said, was like taunt them, mock them, you know what I mean, ridicule them. The whole famous thing you talked about in your book where he wouldn't even show up and have a debate with Dr. William Lane Craig. You know what I mean? That it was kind of that became like this huge thing on social media at the time with that empty chair, that kind of thing. But now you're seeing a lot of these. Like you said, they may not classify themselves like outright as an atheist. Um, or maybe not even agnostic, but they're very receptive. They're very open. But of course, the atheist community holds them as their own and says, no, Tom
Mm-hmm.
belongs to us, you know what I mean? That kind of thing. But you're seeing this great genuineness. And I think that's so important to touch on because oftentimes people say, oh, I have an atheist friend or whatever, and they feel very alarmed or intimidated to engage with them. But what you're sharing, and again, encouraging people to get your book and even listen to your podcast, things are shifting. So, one thing you touched on a little bit, and maybe even as you give insight from people like Tom and others, what is this dissipation that we are actually seeing now? Because, like you said, for quite some time, you can go back to the days of Bertrand Russell, in the early 20th century, the great, British philosopher, and, that famous lecture in the book, later in the series that came out, Why I'm Not a Christian, and how that
Mm-hmm.
advanced so many people to atheism before people like Dawkins came on scene. But that there's a dissipation that's going on right now. Kind of touch on that to let our listeners know what that looks like.
Well, as I say, I think that the new atheism has been waning in popularity and appeal and influence for the last several years. In many ways, though, the new atheism itself was only the sort of the final part of a long sequence of, you could say, secularization in the West. So we'd obviously been seeing church going decline, especially in the UK and Europe, for a number of decades before Richard Dawkins came on the scene. And Bertrand Russell, 100 years ago, was sort of a well-known atheist writing Why I'm Not a Christian and so on. So atheists had always been there. I think what's happened, though, is that I think secular materialism, if you like, the view that all that exists is matter in motion, and the idea that we can live without God, I think it's just an idea that's been tested and is starting to run out of steam. And I say that because the problem is that you can't you can't stop people being intrinsically religious. And I think this is what the new atheists have realized, that actually we're kind of primed to worship
Mm.
something. And if we don't worship God, if we don't have the Christian story, we'll replace it with another story. Now, the new atheists wanted us to replace it with sort of science and reason. That was their hope, that we'd move into this sort of secular rationalist utopia. But that is not what happened, actually. In fact, what's happened is that all kinds of other stories have come to dominate in our secular world. And we're kind of replacing the Christian story with quasi-religious stories, such as the growth of kind of sacred ideologies on the progressive left around gender and sexuality and so on, and even arguably on the political right, certain savior figures, political heroes, who are going to save America and so on. There's always something that will kind of put in the place of God. And it doesn't lead to this kind of utopia of science and rationalism as I think the new atheists naively thought it would. In fact, it leads to what we're seeing now, the culture wars. And moreover, it leads to a meaning crisis. And this is kind of a key part of my book and my thesis and the podcast series, is that actually what the new atheists did by kind of clearing the ground from the Christian story was they left a void. They left this meaning crisis, because we need a story to make sense of our life. And what you have now is a burgeoning mental health crisis among young people. You have record numbers of suicides among young men. And it's proof that simply adding more technology, more wealth, more prosperity, that won't actually increase happiness in a population. You need something to live for. You need a story to make sense of your life by. And increasingly, even in our very technological age, that's actually accelerating this meaning crisis, because we're becoming increasingly disembodied, and we don't live in community anymore. We don't have the benefits of ritual, and we don't have that story that once subconsciously gave us our sense of meaning, purpose, and identity. And so what you're seeing now is I think the fact that people are turning back towards God, the fact that people are taking the Christian story seriously again, is because the actual story they've been told, this atheist story of reality, just isn't doing it anymore. It's not working for them. And so that's why I think people are now turning away from the new atheists and turning to some of these interesting thinkers like the Jordan Petersons of this world, who are kind of directing people back towards the value of the Christian story. The specific metaphor I use in the book for this is what I call the turning of the tide,
Mm-hmm.
because 150 years ago, the Victorian poet Matthew Arnold wrote this famous poem, Dover Beach, which included a stanza about the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith. And in his day, that stood for the way that secularism and science and technology was kind of taking the place of God.
Yeah.
Go 150 years to our day, that's only increased, it's only accelerated. And yet, it was a conversation with another secular thinker, Douglas Murray, that made me think of this. He said, the thing about the sea of faith, Justin, is that it could come back in again. That is the point of tides. And I just think we're at one of those stages where the tide doesn't go out forever. The sea of faith won't go out forever. It will come back in. And I think we're just at that moment where the tide is beginning to turn, as people start to ask, maybe we jettisoned the Christian story too soon. And I just see all kinds of ways in which we're seeing people start to reevaluate it. And I just wondered if we're at the very beginning of that tide starting to return again.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, and it's powerful to witness. And the amazing thing is how you and others have an outreach to befriend this type of community who are longing for community. Now they don't have the fellowship that you and I have in the Holy Spirit. that we're baptized into one faith and, in one baptism and one Lord, Ephesians 4, and we have this unity of the spirit of the bond of peace. And like you said, there is this yearning, there's this longing. It reminded me when I just saw that recent sit down between Richard Dawkins and Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and what was it called? Do you remember that one? It was
The one in New York, the Dissident
yeah,
Dialogues event.
exactly, the dissident dialogue, exactly. And prior to this, obviously Dawkins had already been referring to himself as a cultural Christian. But what I thought was so interesting psychologically and relationally was his demeanor with Ian on stage. He was very fatherly. His demeanor was down. He tried to go back to his kind of tactics that he would use. Well, it's just nonsense. That's just not believable. So you're seriously telling me you believe in the virgin birth, that you believe Jesus rose, and that kind of stuff. Like, you seriously can't believe that, right? So his definition, obviously, of Christianity is not a biblical one. But I thought it was very interesting that here one of his dear friends has had,
Mm.
a conversion, and I think it's shocking him. It's surprising him.
Yeah. Mm.
So one of
Yeah,
the things
it
I
is.
want,
It
yeah,
is.
it is shocking him. So are you seeing that take place with even the younger generation, or like someone like an Alex O'Connor, the cosmic skeptic? Because again, a lot of these are British people, by the way, as you know. It's
Yeah.
like the British atheists are influencing everything, Justin. So your job as the British Christian is you got to counter that. But it's like, I mean, are you seeing a huge shift though with even people like Alex and Stephen, like these with rationality rules, where they seem to be very open and receptive? You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
I, I
In a
would I,
way,
I would say that there's definitely been a shift in the way they engage. So I mean, just sticking with Iron Hirsi for a moment. I mean, it was an extraordinary thing when, in November last year she wrote this
oh yeah,
article, "Why I'm Now a Christian." It was deliberately a pun on, Bertrand
yeah,
Russell's
yeah, exactly.
article of 100 years before, and and I think Richard Dawkins was absolutely mind boggled.
Yeah, he was.
Surprised is kind of an understatement. And so was I, frankly, because here was someone who was probably up to that point the most famous female atheist in the world. She was, if you like, the fifth horse person of the new atheism. And here she was saying she'd changed her mind. She was embracing Christianity. Now, there was a lot of ink spilled over the nature of her conversion, and was it just a sort of political, cultural thing? But no, actually, when you actually read, the article, when you then see the interviews she's done, there's obviously been a really interesting emotional, spiritual component to this embrace. And when she met Richard Dawkins for that New York dialogue, it was just so interesting to see the way she now obviously sees life
Yeah,
kind of in a different dimension to him. Whereas he still sees only atoms, electrons, the physical workings. She's just opened her mind to see that actually there's more to life than that. And so it was still a very friendly conversation. And I think that's the value of it, actually, is that, but because they're friends, it enables a different kind of a conversation than Dawkins would have with, I don't know, a William Lane Craig or a John Lennox, where he's immediately defensive. Now he landed his usual blows, as it were, during that conversation, but I don't think he can't just write her off in the way that he does other Christians, and I think that's really interesting, and I think it's part of why I think there's been quite a change in tone by Richard Dawkins himself. Now, he's obviously not a Christian, but he's much more likely to call himself a cultural Christian, to kind of recognize the value of Christianity in the West, and to kind of recognize that new atheism didn't do what it hoped to do, that it hasn't produced this culture, this scientific, utopia that he was hoping for. And then when I look at someone like an Alex O'Connor, who's well known online as Cosmic Skeptic, very popular atheist YouTuber, or Stephen Woodford, aka Rationality Rules, again, these are both people who I think started out their YouTube careers several years ago quite influenced by the sort of Hitchens new atheist, quite sarcastic, cutting approach. But they've actually changed their output a lot, especially Alex O'Connor, actually, who now films videos criticizing his first videos as a teenage atheist, because he says, actually, I've changed my mind. I think some of the arguments are better than I thought they were at first, and that kind of thing. And it's just very open to talking about God, to talking about faith. He doesn't see this as sort of religion is evil and we have to extinguish it and exterminate it. And I think he genuinely wants to know the truth. And I've always found my dialogues with him very friendly. And so often it feels like he may be on the verge of,
Yeah.
something because he's quoting C.S. Lewis left, right, and center. He's, I think he absolutely recognizes the faith of the people around him, that it's intellectually kind of tenable for them, even if he hasn't arrived there himself. So again, these now, I will say absolutely, Alex O'Connor has not become a Christian, but I don't see that as impossible by any means. And I think he would say himself, if the circumstances were right, if that argument was right, if he had an experience which perhaps he couldn't deny, then yeah, he'd be open to it. I don't sense the kind of closed kind of mentality that there has been in the past among the kind of the new atheist fraternity in that way.
Yeah, I was just thinking about when you're mentioning Stephen Woodford. I mean, brilliant guy, smart, young guy, and appreciate, his tone sometimes and his love for philosophy like you and I love. I mean, that was what I majored in originally, was in philosophy. And so I like how he tries to reason and he points on certain things. Obviously, we believe he's completely off when it comes to his conclusion on many things, but recently he debated our good friend Dr. Paul Copan, about the existence of God. But then I saw Stephen's follow up videos based off that debate, and I started to see a little tone again. And it's
Mm,
almost like things are irritating them because I think they're really like, because he's like full fledged. You don't see that type of treatment when it comes to anything else. Because you go back to Ayan, she
mm,
was, from Kenya, and the Muslim Brotherhood ruled where she lived in the 1980s when she was a Muslim herself before she turned to atheism. So it's like here, this woman has organized religion through and through, comes from a culture, comes to the States years later, obviously, embraces atheism. That still is finding wanting. And I'm seeing that trend, like you said, with even someone like Steven recently, with just his tone of how he comes after engaging someone like you or me or Paul. And there's this care and there's this respect and there's this hospitality. Reminds me of Romans
mm,
chapter 12, verse 16, or like 1 Peter 2:17, that we're to show we're to be hospitable, we're to show love for the
mm,
brotherhood. And I'm encouraging people watching or listening, as Justin's talking about this in his book, this surprising rebirth of belief in God. It is taking place, my friends. And the amazing thing is, like you mentioned earlier, and I love it when you talked about this in the book, because this is what I was scratching my head about too. Like this recent sit down between Jordan Peterson and Alex O'Connor. And
mm,
everyone, like in our space, is watching it. Both of these guys are not professing Christians, but they're so supportive
mm,
of the advancement of Christianity. Speak on that a little bit, just about those two dynamics of two guys like that
mm.
coming together. What were your thoughts about that sit down that they had recently?
Yeah, I I managed to catch up in private with Alex about this recently as well, and I think it's just a mark of how much his star has risen. As a YouTuber, that he's being invited, to fly out to interview people like Jordan Peterson on his channel. And what I love about Alex is, even though he's still an atheist, he
Mm-hmm.
he asks all the same questions I would want to ask of both his Christian and atheist guests. So when he interviewed Richard Dawkins recently, he pretty much asked all the questions I would have wanted to ask Dawkins, and he didn't kind of just give him an easy ride or anything like that. He asked some really interesting perspective, very good, compelling questions, and the same for Jordan Peterson actually. And I think I got the sense watching that Jordan Peterson quite enjoyed the encounter because he was someone, yeah, a young guy, but kind of putting him through his paces, forcing him
Yeah.
to sort of, really answer some tough questions. So the one that I thought, was really important was Alex really drilling down and wouldn't let it go. Well, look, you talk a lot in metaphorical terms about the value of faith and the resurrection, for instance, but do you believe that Jesus really walked out of the tomb? And it was so interesting because, in the end, Peterson said, well, on balance, yeah, if there was a video camera recording it, I think maybe he did. He was kind of willing to go that far. And that was sort of more than I'd heard him
Yeah.
say in kind of
Yeah.
concrete terms. And for me, I agree with Alex there. I think it is really important whether Jesus physically rose from the dead. I think there's a great deal of value, obviously, in the symbolism and the metaphor and the cultural value in the Bible and Christianity. But if it's all just metaphor and symbol, if there's nothing concrete that kind of actually where God stepped into time and space and made a difference, then actually we're, as Paul said, we are of all people the most to be pitied,
Yeah.
because it absolutely stands or falls on whether Jesus rose from the dead, whether the God of all time and space came into our space and took on flesh and defeated death. And so I think Alex knows that. I think he's, in that sense, he's asking all the right questions, and but he's also doing it in a way where, yeah, he's not kind of trying to trap people or pin people down or whatever. I think he does it in a very open-handed, winsome way. So it was a pleasure to listen to that conversation, and I'm really glad in a sense that there are people like Alex and Jordan Peterson, both, as you say, not professing Christians, but actually who are opening up the God question for people, in a funny way. Sometimes in God's providence, I think people can sometimes do more for the kingdom when they're outside the church than when they're inside the church. So it's not, obviously I want them both to become Christians and accept Christ. But at the same time, I can see the way God's using people like them actually to just reach a huge and wide secular audience. And I just think it's quite a remarkable thing that's happening in that way.
It is remarkable, and this is why you touched on it so well in your book about this exact thing. This is a surprising rebirth. I mean, obviously, we know that Jordan Peterson's wife, as you were mentioning somebody earlier, who I think Tom Holland, right? He had cancer, and you said in desperation prayed.
Mm, mm.
And I know a lot of critics would be thinking, well, he doesn't really believe in the God of the Bible, so how do we know he was really healed? Look, God can do whatever he wants in his creation, right? And if someone's crying out and believing, and God uses that as a way to heal him, as we see throughout Scripture, of God performing miracles to show that he is real, there's no doubt that that occurred. We saw that with Jordan Peterson's wife, not too
Mm.
long ago, when she had cancer, and then she came back to the Catholic faith. And prior to that, we know their daughter, she came. Now she's not a Catholic, right? I think she's more Protestant.
No, no. So I think, yeah, I think Michaela, yeah, is a Protestant Christian,
Yeah,
and Tammy has embraced Catholicism. That's right.
yeah. So you see that the two closest people in Jordan Peterson's life are women of faith,
Mm, mm.
right?
Absolutely, and also a lot of his closest confidants and the
Yeah,
thinkers he respects are,
yeah.
Jonathan Pajot, a longtime friend of his now, is a well-respected Orthodox Christian thinker who he frequently engages in conversations with, and you see him frequently engaging nowadays with people like Bishop Robert Barron, with John
Hmm.
Lennox, with James Orr, a theologian here in the UK, and others, and obviously Jordan Peterson, some of his most popular material continues to be his Genesis series, his new Exodus series, and so on. So it feels like the net is drawing in. Now, in the end, I don't know exactly where Jordan Peterson is on the spectrum, and in some, and again, I would love him to become a sort of fully fledged Christian, but at the same time, as I said earlier, I still see people being influenced towards faith and walking through the door to Christianity because of his influence. And even if he sort of doesn't quite know where he lands, he's actually opened the door to a lot of other people to walk through it.
Yeah, exactly. Now, another thing that when you do look at it for what it is in the literary space, and I love the fact that you touched on this, Justin, because it really um, uh, points to the amazing conversions that have taken place among many prominent literary figures. And you talked about, A.N. Wilson, you talked about Spooford and Ordway, of course, C.S. Lewis. What makes these conversions, because I know we talked about some recent conversions, but when you do look in the literary space, primarily C.S. Lewis, who obviously was reading many
Mm,
Christian thinkers after the war, when he was a professor, a young professor, G.K. Chesterton particularly, and you mentioned a lot of people like Alex O'Connor reading a lot of C.S. Lewis, and so that's powerful, right? When you're seeing this connection that's
mm.
taking place in the literary space, but really a lot of these thinkers, a lot of these prominent figures have influenced the world in their writings. And over time, they have come to Christ. So, talk about some of these significant figures that you talked about in the book and why you wanted to put them in the book specifically.
That's right. Well, a lot of these figures do have a similar journey actually to C.S. Lewis, who is well known that he was an atheist in his younger years, and he had this quite dramatic conversion, firstly to theism and then to Christianity, which of course he tells in his book Surprised by Joy. And he was influenced by, some of his contemporaries like J.R. Tolkien, who was a great friend of his at Oxford. And in many ways, Lewis's journey was one where he had trouble reconciling, if you like, his imaginative world that really fired everything he loved, literature, poetry, mythology, and so on. He had trouble reconciling that world, which he lived and breathed, with the sort of the world of science and atheism and rationality, which he assumed had to kind of exist in a separate sphere, and the two couldn't meet. But it was really partly the influence actually of J.R. Tolkien, who helped him to see that actually all of that literature and mythology and poetry could find its home in Jesus Christ, that actually Christ was the true myth, if you like. It wasn't that he was just one more myth among many, but that actually he had come and sort of fulfilled all of those religious longings expressed in so much poetry and literature and other faiths. And and in that sense, he didn't have to kind of choose between these. It brought things together in a beautiful way, and I see that happening with a number of these other literary figures that I talk about in the book, who have experienced themselves adult conversions to faith. Holly Ordway is an interesting example, who herself grew up on Narnia and the Lord of the Rings, and came to love poetry in particular when she became an English professor. But in the course of doing that, she came to realize, firstly, obviously, that some of the fantasy literature she loved the most was written by Christians, and that actually a lot of the poetry she most enjoyed was also written by Christians, people like Gerard Manley Hopkins and others. And she just remembers this one time when she was, I think she was reading a poem, and she just said it felt like she had touched a live wire. And it was a description of the Trinity that she was reading. Batter My Heart, Three-Person God by John Donne. And she kind of recognized that those feelings she had weren't ultimately just electrons and chemical activity in her brain, that there was something real about that. They connected to something real. And that was really what took her on a journey to looking into the claims of Christianity of some of her most best loved poets and authors. And that took her eventually to Christian faith. But it happens in different ways for different people. Another person's story I tell in the book, much more recent convert, is Paul Kingsnorth, who's a celebrated author and poet here in the UK, who's got a background in sort of environmental activism. But he kind of went through a period basically of teenage atheism, where he rejected any kind of Anglican upbringing he'd had, but then turned to Buddhism for many years in his life, because he still sort of felt a certain pull towards spirituality. But he kind of had long rejected Christianity and institutional religion. But eventually he found even Buddhism wasn't right for him. It wasn't making sense, because he felt the need to worship something. And he loved nature. He was a really outdoors man. He loved spending time in the woods and the mountains. And so he for a few years he became a Wiccan. He joined Wicca, and he was kind of doing, the kind of chanting in the woods and everything, because he thought, well, maybe I could worship nature. But even that he eventually found didn't make sense. He realized that it was just a pastiche, really, of sort of 60s sort of melodrama and Christian heresy, really, is what he came to realize. But what happened to Paul Kingsnorth is that all kinds of interesting things started happening. Christians started coming out of the woodwork. Some of his readers, who turned out were Christian pastors. One day his wife, quite out of the blue, said to him, "You're going to become a Christian." And he said, "What are you talking about? Don't be ridiculous." But then he started having dreams about Jesus. And he said he basically got pulled kicking and screaming out of Wicca. But he came to see that actually the Christian story, against all his expectations, was the true story of reality. And it was the story that made sense of all those other stories. It was a very C.S. Lewis-like journey. And he joined the Eastern Orthodox Church only a few years ago, surprised a lot of his readership base with this adult conversion to Christianity. But he's by far from the only person, actually, who I've seen this happening to in recent years. So just another interesting story of someone whose deep longings, if you like, ultimately found their answer in the person of Jesus Christ.
Mm. That's so beautiful. I mean, when you touch on that like that, and you do it so well in the book, it is like that C.S. Lewis esque kind of, coming to Jesus and the complete story and finding true meaning and joy in Jesus, and not to take that so lightly. And I know sometimes people get so fixated on these other conversion stories, but the literary space, like you said, has been so prevalent, so prominent, and captures so much of this compelling longing that so many people are wanting. And I just love that aspect of it in the book. Now I hate to do this, Justin, but as we do wrap up, and I appreciate just this conversation and talking about the surprising rebirth of belief in God. And I don't want to put you on the spot. Okay. So if you don't want to answer this, you don't have to. Okay. But you've
I'm feeling
interviewed a
the
lot.
pressure already.
Yeah. You've interviewed a lot of compelling atheists. And I know a lot of them are friends of yours. So I'm not saying you're going to do any favorites here, like you're going to show your favorites. But who do you think, in all of your years of sitting down with a lot of these atheists, right? All different backgrounds, genres and professions. But who's been the most compelling atheist that you've interviewed and why?
Oh, who's been the most compelling atheist that I've interviewed? I I would say probably probably in all honesty, it would be someone like Alex O'Connor. Um,
Okay.
and I think that's because I think it's easier to maybe shrug off an atheist who you sense has an axe to grind, who is sort of on team atheist and kind of has kind of made their decision and isn't going to budge. Whereas I think when you meet an atheist who's genuinely says they've looked, they've searched, and Alex is one of those people who has, surrounded himself actually with Christian friends. He spent a number of years living with Christian
Yeah.
housemates and did a theology degree. He took this seriously. He kind of went on a search. He wanted to find out, and he still hasn't arrived. He's certainly changed his mind on a lot of things, and he takes a much more nuanced approach, I think, now to the God conversation. But he still hasn't arrived there yet. And that is very challenging for me because I absolutely respect him. I feel he's being honest in his journey, and so I guess my question then is, oh God, why haven't you why hasn't the magic happened with Alex? What's going on there? So I find those quite challenging. Those kinds of because when I sense there's a genuine search, I think, for God, and someone it just hasn't happened for them for whatever reason, it leaves me scratching my head. Now I obviously I can't see into someone's soul, and I don't know what's going on, at a heart level for Alex or anyone. And I just have to leave that in God's hands, that God will do right by every person. But those are probably the more challenging ones. It's not so much that some kind of amazing argument against God or whatever that does it for me. It's more when I see a genuine seeker,
Hmm.
but who just hasn't found it. That's probably the one that leaves me with the most questions in that kind of way.
Yeah. I mean, that's well said. Great answer. Didn't mean to put you on the spot there, but I mean, it's like you do think about all of the years of sitting with some of these big names who have a platform and are telling people there's no God, there's really no purpose or meaning in life. And but yet, like you said, you stumble upon someone like Alex, and he's coming around for sure.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
continue
And
to
and
yeah,
and, uh, and that's the joy of it, no one's story is over till it's over. And even Alex in kind of in jest, but I think maybe in half seriousness, has said maybe the reason I'm not a Christian yet is because God, it'll be even better for God if I hold out for another 10 years, and bring all these atheists with me. But I don't know. Who knows? So yeah, I know. Yeah, we can't guess God's mind. I simply have faith that God is good and that ultimately His will be done, whether Alex comes to faith or not. But yeah, I guess that would be yeah. That's kind of where I go when it comes to the sort of the more compelling side of the atheist case.
yeah. I agree with you as well. All right, brother. So just tell people where they can get your book and then your main website that people can go to support your ministry.
Well, if you want to get hold of the book, you can get it via my website, justinbrierley.com. In fact, you can get signed copies of the book there as well. And that's also the place if you want to find the Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God podcast series. It's very much complementary to the book, but we do a much bigger, deeper dive
Hmm.
into all of the issues that we've been talking about. And I've just been thrilled at how many people have been getting in touch to say it's helped them in their journey. Lots of non-Christians as well who are listening and describing themselves now as lapsed atheists and this sort of thing. So I think it's an exciting time. The book hopefully will help Christians to kind of know how to understand the times we're living in and the way the conversation has changed. And I hope the podcast series will do the same. So if you want both of those, justinbrierley.com. And if you want to support, if you want to get my newsletter, all of that good stuff, you can do it there from the website as well. Again, it's justinbrierley.com.
Yeah, and I want people to know too that that's something that we really want to. As you're listening to this, if you guys have a friend, which we all do, and a family member who are maybe agnostic or skeptic or searching, I just got a text today with one of our supporters in Stand Strong Ministries, and they were saying, "Hey, what are some good resources for a friend whose brother passed away, and now is asking about afterlife? Like, is there an afterlife? What does that look like?" And he's searching. He's not a believer, but he wants to know more about the Christian faith. And so I encourage you guys to support the work that Justin's doing. If you have a family member that you want to learn how to engage them in a loving fashion, to speak the truth in love, Ephesians 4:15. That's what we do on this podcast. Make sure you go to justinbrierley.com and support the work that he's doing globally to help Christians just like you and like me to be equipped to engage people who are searching for answers in this world. Justin, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me on, Jason. It's been an absolute pleasure to be with you.
And my friends, continue to have those challenging conversations. Don't shy away from them. As you heard about the stories that Justin shared on this podcast, there are people who are waiting and longing to have real connection with people of faith. So be that person, have those challenging conversations. Until next time, keep standing strong in your faith.